So we have a pretty wide remit for what we're talking about. Bitcoin as a savings technology, blue sky vision for what that means in the future and what it looks like today. I want to bring up our two wonderful panelists, Muneeb and Meltem. Come on up here. So Muneeb, of course, started the Stacks project. Meltem is Chief Strategy Officer at CoinShares. And once we sit down, we will kick it off.
Great. Should we sit closer together? I feel like we're very far apart.
I think it's a COVID protocol.
I like you guys.
Okay, so I want to start with the news out of Lebanon as our entry point to this idea of Bitcoin as a savings technology. Now, over the weekend, the deputy PM said that the state and the central bank had gone bankrupt. That fact is being disputed by the central bank governor. But at the end of the day, this is a country that for 3 years, for multiple years, has been, the banking sector has been suffering. And you've seen the currency plummet by 90%, more than 90%. And so a lot of people are losing their life savings. And, Meltem, you've talked about this idea of Bitcoin as an antidote to chaos. And I guess I just want to start with the broad question of how does Bitcoin fix this?
Yeah, look, I think I'll start by saying Bitcoin's not a panacea to all of the world's problems. Like, a lot of the issues we have in our world with money are systemic in nature, and they involve not just technology and like the underlying philosophy and fundamentals of how we manage sovereign issued currencies, but there are a variety of issues. And you don't even have to go to Lebanon or Ukraine or Cyprus to see this. My family's Turkish. My parents are from Turkey. I have a lot of family members in Turkey. Right now, inflation in Turkey is rampant, and people can no longer afford the lifestyle they had 6 months ago, 12 months ago, due to the rapid debasement of currency. So this is impacting people, in parts of the world that maybe most of us aren't from or haven't been to, but it's also coming to the United States. If you look at what's happening to inflation in this country, I think very quickly people are starting to recognize these things we've read about in history books around hyperinflation and monetary debasement. They're no longer just ideas, it's actually happening here. And so I think what's interesting about Bitcoin, Muneeb and I met, 8 years ago at this point, when Stacks was Namecoin and we're in a totally different place. But even back then, the big thing we were talking about is what Bitcoin does is you can't inflate Bitcoin. You can't print more Bitcoin. There's no central entity that's in charge of Bitcoin, even though in the year 2022, people are still fucking trying. So hello, Chris Larson, who is now trying to exert control over Bitcoin source code. We've done this many times. The beautiful thing about Bitcoin is Bitcoin's issuance is set in stone. The protocol has been functioning for the last 13 years without downtime, without interruption. And so I think what's fantastic and what Stacks is doing, many other projects are trying to emulate, but I think are going to be challenged to emulate, is Bitcoin has this beautiful element where no one single entity can control it, change the code, or force changes upon the user base, the holder base. And I think in a world like the one we live in today, where we see the politics of influence have shifted dramatically, it's no longer just nation states on the geopolitical stage, it's also corporation states. There are a number of American corporations and foreign corporations who are now larger than G20 economies in terms of market cap and their annual revenue. Meta, aka Facebook, has over 3 billion daily active users, so over half of the planet's population is using a software product issued and coded by them on a daily basis. So we have corporation states, and now we have these decentralized digital states in the form of Bitcoin. And so I think it's incredibly exciting to see what's happening on the political stage with Bitcoin, with nation states adopting it, but also individuals pushing it forward. There are 300 million Bitcoiners around the world. We need to up those numbers, not number go up, but number of users and number of holders go up. And we'll see in this year's midterm election here in the United States how Bitcoin is going to dramatically alter the political landscape as well. Because I don't know about you, who's voting for pro-Bitcoin candidates? Fuck yeah, let's do that. Let's put Bitcoiners in office and let's focus on shifting policy to make Bitcoin a core component of how we think about innovation and preserving innovation here in the United States, but also abroad.
Are you running for office?
I'm not running. No.
So many fantastic talking points.
No, I'm not running for office. I live in New Hampshire. I am on the governor's sort of like crypto commission, and my neighbor Bruce Fenton is running for Senate. He's challenging Maggie Hassan for her Senate seat, so I will be voting for him. But I'm not interested in politics. I'm interested in Bitcoin and driving Bitcoin forward. So I think I'm better served doing that from where I sit now.
Fantastic. Muneeb, what are your thoughts? Maybe take us back to Lebanon, and then we'll come back through a lot of the other topics that were outlined just now.
Yeah, I think first of all, I'm just so excited to be here. There's so many familiar faces. This community has grown so much. And I think we haven't done this in a while. The last time probably there was a Stacks community event was a couple of years ago. I'm just super excited to see so many people here. Welcome everyone. Coming back to Bitcoin as savings, I feel like that is something very fundamental. I grew up in Pakistan, and over there, it's a very culturally acceptable thing that people don't trust the local currency, right? So if you want to have savings, your options are you either purchase gold. That's why gold is like very big in Pakistan and India. You buy land. So a lot of people, they would work their entire life and then basically buy some piece of land. And these things are hard assets. You don't keep your savings in the local currency in rupees because you're seeing it like lose value year over year, and you can actually feel it, right? Because they're losing value so rapidly that people can actually feel it. That just makes the concept like very real. I think what has happened in some of the Western countries is that an entire generation has basically never felt it. They've never felt inflation, and that is beginning to change now. I think we are at the cusp of something very big, where normal people have kind of like started feeling like what inflation is, right? When people are like, wait a minute, the numbers are now hitting, official numbers are hitting like close to 10%. I think just last week I saw this headline that in Germany they're raising food prices between 20 to 50%. If they cross 50%, that's the official definition of hyperinflation, above 50% like month over month. Right? So I think once people start feeling that, they're certainly going to wake up and go like, okay, what do I do now? Because interestingly, where I grew up in Pakistan, you could exit to the British pound or you could exit to the dollar, right? But if this is happening to the dollar, where do you exit? Yeah. You exit to freedom, you exit to Bitcoin. And I think that's the concept that a lot of people are going to understand. Like I feel like our industry has grown so much. Obviously, we're here for Bitcoin Miami Week. It's bigger than ever, but this is still really, really, really early days. Like these concepts are not mainstream. Not a lot of people fully understand how Bitcoin works and what it can do for them.
You both hit on the same theme, which is if you look at a long enough time horizon, this was actually, I'm pulling this from a post that Marty Bent just put out, but he was saying that if you look at a long enough time horizon, if you have your savings stored in fiat currency, he thinks it will suffer. And this is what you both are talking about. And Meltem, you've made the point that this is the first time that we've seen Bitcoin in an inflationary environment, which has been illuminating. And like a lot of what you do is look at these data over longer time horizons. And I wonder whether we can talk a bit more about this dynamic of Bitcoin and savings and the role of inflation like in the last 2 years and where we go from here.
Yeah, I think one of the things, and I'll just sort of bring this back to what's going on in the Stacks ecosystem as well, in Bitcoin more broadly. So if we think about where Bitcoin started, when I started working in the Bitcoin industry in 2015, we're still at the point where people were accumulating Bitcoin, and Bitcoin was primarily viewed as an asset and an investment. And so the entire narrative around Bitcoin was always, oh, it's going to go up X%, look at how much its value has appreciated. I think with the introduction in 2017 of Ethereum and smart contracts, and then in 2018 and 2019, the beginnings of the DeFi or decentralized finance ecosystem on top of Ethereum, what we started to see is people looking at Bitcoin, which we have to remember at that point, Bitcoin dominance historically was around 70%. So 70% of the overall market cap of cryptocurrencies was Bitcoin. And people started looking at this massive pile of Bitcoin collateral that wasn't being utilized. Bitcoin is an incredible form of collateral because it's highly liquid. There's deep liquid markets, meaning that you can liquidate Bitcoin very quickly. And because Bitcoin settles with finality, you have these settlement guarantees around the capital that you're taking as a collateral for loans. And so what we started to do was take Bitcoin and make it compatible with Ethereum through this process of wrapping it and bridging it over to Ethereum. Does anyone know how much of Bitcoin's supply is on the Ethereum network today as wrapped Bitcoin?
1%. All Bitcoin in circulation.
What do you think?
I think it's 1 or slightly below 1%.
It's 2% actually, so fun statistic. But 95% is fully custodial. So 95% of the methods that we have to wrap that Bitcoin is fully custodial, meaning we didn't actually remove this issue we have in traditional credit structures where you have a financial intermediary that controls that collateral and can do all sorts of funny things with that collateral, like rehypothecate it, et cetera, which has caused so many of the challenges we see in traditional credit markets. And so one of the interesting things to observe has been the emergence of BitFi, or what I'm calling Bitcoin DeFi. I don't know if we've officially agreed on that term, but I think BitFi is a good one. I don't know. If anyone has ideas, we can workshop it later. But I think this emerging idea of Bitcoin native DeFi is picking up a lot of steam. And again, I think the challenge for all of us in this room and what I want us to think about as we build this BitFi ecosystem is how do we ensure that the way we're making Bitcoin compatible with DeFi is non-custodial, doesn't create the same vulnerabilities and the same challenges with intermediaries that we've seen traditionally, and continues to remain true to sort of the ethos of Bitcoin. I do think a lot of times in DeFi and what's happening just in Web3 generally, we're taking a lot of shortcuts. We're making compromises with security and decentralization to deliver speed, efficiency, and low cost, and that doesn't work. And we've seen that. There have been over $1 billion of hacks in the last 3 months alone in L2s and bridges. So I think it's very important for us to continue to sort of think about security and decentralization as core principles. That's the whole thing that makes Bitcoin really attractive, and I think we've sacrificed a lot of that in order to bring capital efficiency into DeFi or sort of decentralized finance markets, and that doesn't work. But ultimately, what's so cool to me about Bitcoin, like from the first time I started learning about Bitcoin, still today, 10 years later, what's so cool about Bitcoin, to the point you were making, Muneeb, is you don't need permission. It doesn't matter where in the world you live. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you believe in. Like today, we have so much identity politicking. We have so much redlining. We have people trying to censor and police each other's thoughts, and that's not what Bitcoin's about. It doesn't matter who you are. You could be a dog on the internet. If you have an internet connection and you have the willingness and ability to learn, you can get into Bitcoin. You can accumulate Bitcoin. You don't even have to buy it. There are multiple ways for you to earn Bitcoin doing stuff you already do online, which is super cool. And then once you have a little bit of Bitcoin, you can do a bunch of really interesting stuff with it. You can get a loan against it. You can use it as collateral. You can go to Arcadico and you can take out a self-paying loan, which is such a cool concept using the stacking mechanism on stacks. So what I love is that for the first time, like my cousin in Turkey, he's 22 years old, didn't go to college, he's doing stuff with Bitcoin, and it doesn't matter who he is, he doesn't need anyone's permission or approval. Like Bitcoin doesn't care who you are, and I think it's very important in the world we live in today for people to have access to this, because it's super powerful, it's incredibly important, and I think this is actually gonna be the biggest battle of our lifetime, is the battle against totalitarianism and authoritarianism, which is happening right here in this country with the Earn It bill and all of these efforts to remove our ability to use end-to-end encryption and communication tools. Our financial privacy is being rapidly eroded. We don't think about it, we don't talk about it because we're being distracted by all of the identity politics, but it's happening right here. And so it's really important that Bitcoin exists, that we continue to defend Bitcoin, and that we build products and tools that maintain the central ethos of Bitcoin, which is permissionless. That's it.
You know, on that.
That's it. Like, it's super simple.
On that last point, I was having this conversation with Alex Gladstein about the dictator's dilemma, right? And so, you know, China and Russia, Bitcoin goes against the ethos in many ways of, as you said, it's permissionless, and you don't have control over it, and there are a whole set of rules that can't be adjusted. But we recently saw the weaponization of FX reserves in Russia, right? And so now there is this interesting use case where Bitcoin can actually be, quite helpful to governments like the Chinese government or the Russian government. I wonder whether, do we see Bitcoin become the world's reserve currency, starting with players like Russia and China?
What do you think, Muneeb?
Sure.
What a question also. Is this being live streamed?
I think it is. So, yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. So the dynamic that's playing out there is a little bit like, the enemy of your enemy is your friend. Yeah. And over there, but the interesting thing about Bitcoin is that Bitcoin is truly neutral, and different people go to neutral playing fields for different reasons, right? So if there is a conflict, if there's a war-like situation, you would want to go and play at a neutral playing field. And Bitcoin is welcoming to everybody, right? So I feel like it's an interesting exercise to see that the type of scenarios in which people would become pro-Bitcoin, like you would have never thought about that hey, there would be some sort of a war conflict, which is sad, but at the same time, like that is actually helping to raise awareness for these technologies. I think I've tweeted about this earlier as well, that one of the somewhat sad things about this technology is that we truly believe in it. We think that this is the way the world is going to be, and you're early. But at the same time, the rest of the world is going to realize how important these technologies are in rather painful ways. Right? It's a little bit like every time something breaks in the existing world, be it like financial markets or some currency that is losing value, people are actually losing their life savings, or there's a war conflict. Like sadly, it's things like that are raising more awareness for neutral, open technologies like Bitcoin than anything else, right? So it's a little bit like, I think it's part of like our responsibility, people who are able to kind of like understand the impact of these technologies early on, to then help educate other people as much as we can. And I think that's an ethos that we've seen in the Bitcoin community a lot, because people do feel that responsibility, that once you have been orange pilled and you see the light, you feel this immense responsibility that you have to now go and tell your family about it, tell your friends about it, tell the people that you care about that you need to educate yourself as well before you're kind of like forced into realizing like what's happening in the world and what this technology can mean for us.
Muneeb, I want to stay with you for a minute. So Meltem brought up some of the points, some of the nuances of BitFi or decentralized finance and Bitcoin. But I feel like you're still combating this narrative that smart contracts and Bitcoin don't mix, right? Mm-hmm. And Stacks has been building smart contracts for Bitcoin for years. Mainnet went live in January 2021. So where are we right now?
Yeah, no, that's amazing, right? So a little bit of a historical context there. So I started in the Bitcoin industry in like 2013 or so. So between 2013 and 2014, the Bitcoin industry was actually very open to new ideas. Like if you think of most of the stuff that's kind of like taking off today, like NFTs literally started on Bitcoin. Yeah. If you think about decentralized names, colored coins, like they were kind of like actually ICOs, like they started on Bitcoin. You think about like stablecoin efforts, like there was a thing called like Omni protocol that was implementing Tether. Stablecoin started on Bitcoin. And in general, a lot of people were pretty open to like, okay, let's try and build stuff. And people were pretty open to that, right? And the core thing about whenever you're trying to build something on Bitcoin is, are you going to change the main Bitcoin protocol? And the answer is a big no. Or are you going to just use the infrastructure that's already there and try to bring additional functionality, right? And I think then 2017 happened. And 2017 is, for the first time, like Bitcoin always had like such a high dominance ratio to everything else that everything else was pretty much like a joke, right? Like Bitcoin dominance level is at like 80% or above or something like that. And I think for the first time, there was a project, Ethereum, that was gaining real traction and was getting bigger compared to Bitcoin, right? So there was a lot of talk of the flipping. Like a lot of people were like, Ethereum is going to flip Bitcoin. And at the same time, Bitcoin was having an internal civil war, right? Like there were people who wanted to change Bitcoin's core features, and there was an internal civil war happening. And what happened as a result of that stressful event for the Bitcoin community is that they have reacted in a very negative way to basically saying that building these like smart contracts type things and applications is not useful. Well, clearly it is useful. The markets are saying it's useful, like so many developers and are building there's so much value being created and the industry is moving forward. And B, they became extremely protective of Bitcoin core, like the core protocol. That no one can change this, nothing is ever going to kind of like mess with the protocol. And that's where that narrative clash really comes in. Whereas like fast forward, now we know like how important smart contracts can be. Like we've seen like Ethereum itself is like roughly $500 billion worth of the network, but then $500 billion worth of applications built on top. And a lot of this stuff could have actually happened in the Bitcoin ecosystem, probably in a more decentralized, more thoughtful way. Like, because I do think there are cultural differences between these different communities. In Bitcoin, I do think the code base is more rigorous. The process through which people actually care about if something is actually secure or is actually decentralized, the bar is much, much higher. And I think if we bring those technologies to the Bitcoin ecosystem, it will lead towards a future where these stable coins or NFTs or other things are built in a more thoughtful manner, where they are actually more decentralized or they're directly connected to Bitcoin. And I think that's the thing that really motivates me or people in the Stacks community, that we are bringing all of those features to Bitcoin. But obviously, at times it can be challenging to fight that PTSD that happened in 2017 and the aftermath of that some people are still living with. But I think there is some recent kind of like things that I've noticed where a lot of even the hardcore Bitcoin people are waking up to these technologies as well, which is a very, very encouraging sign.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add to that. I remember, did anyone ever go to the Scaling Bitcoin conferences back in the day? Okay, they were fire. They were great. That's when all the like Bitcoiners, like 500 people in one room, when the community was still tiny. One of the things that we started talking about in 2017 as Ethereum started to sort of grow was the modularization of Bitcoin to make development easier on top of Bitcoin. Because one of the things we don't talk about enough that I think is actually really important for what Stacks is doing with Clarity, smart contract programming language, is like becoming a proficient Bitcoin developer takes a really, really long time. Because anything you build on top of Bitcoin, right, requires like you to have a really deep understanding not only of the protocol itself, but the entire history of BIPs, right? Like you notice this when people are new to Bitcoin, they show up and they're like, I'm here to fix Bitcoin, and they have all these ideas, and I'm like, yeah, go read the history of BIPs. Right, or the Bitcoin improvement process where people can submit proposals to improve the Bitcoin protocol, and you'll see there's like a whole history of failed BIPs where there's a deep dive of all of the technical reasons why certain protocol upgrades and changes won't work. But one of the big challenges is it's really, really hard to become a proficient Bitcoin dev, which inherently limits the speed at which the Bitcoin ecosystem can grow and how quickly you can sort of scale. I think what Stacks does that's really cool is it introduces a more familiar programming language, i.e. Clarity, to a larger ecosystem of devs, because one of the really important things is we need more people hacking on top of Bitcoin, but if it's really difficult to become proficient at Bitcoin core and building on top of Bitcoin, that's inherently going to limit like how much innovation can happen on Bitcoin as a layer one. We see this as well with Lightning. There's a bunch of really cool modular tools being rolled out to help people develop on top of Lightning. We see the implementation of a lot more standards that people can utilize. So everyone's not always rolling their own wallets or their own multi-sig. There are now like standards that you can utilize, which I think are really important. I think one thing we don't think about enough is like, it's important, yes, for Bitcoin Core to remain sort of true to its vision. And I think that ideological sort of purity, quote unquote, is Bitcoin's greatest immune system to corruption from these various outside forces. But at the same time, we have to think about how we can actually scale and grow the Bitcoin ecosystem, because it's not going to happen organically. We need to think practically, not only about developer infrastructure, but also around all of the tooling that needs to exist to make it easier for people to use Bitcoin. Like if I have to do command line level coding to be able to use Bitcoin, that's not gonna work. Me spending my nights like in Stack Overflow trying to figure out what snippet of code I can use, not pretty. So I think that's one of the things we don't think about enough, but a place where I think Stacks has been really effective at bringing more people into the Bitcoin ecosystem. And I was saying to Muneeb, VCs like email me now or text me and they're like, hey, what's going on with Stacks? Like, I'm meeting all of these projects building on Stacks, what's going on with this idea of Bitcoin layer 2 and Bitcoin DeFi, and it's because there are more people that can now build on Bitcoin, which I think is really powerful.
Yeah, let me add to that a little bit. So
I'm so sorry, MacKenzie. We're just going
yeah.
This is great.
So it's basically, there's a recent blog post that Vitalik wrote where he's reflecting over the design choices that they made for Ethereum and what are some of the challenges ahead. I highly recommend that post. I think it's a good one to read. And the summary of the post was effectively that at the end, Vitalik was talking about how Ethereum has a choice to try and become more simple and more decentralized like Bitcoin, or more complex, which Ethereum currently is, and experimental. And they need to pick, right? Because there's this inherent tension between the two things. And effectively, this is literally the Stacks thesis, right? Where Bitcoin is simple, Bitcoin is durable, the opposite of Ethereum. But Stacks is a separate layer, so Stacks can be more complex, can have smart contracts, and it can be more experimental, right? So Ethereum is trying to do both things at the same layer. All we are saying is the solution to this tension is just break it apart into two layers. One layer can be experimental with smart contracts, more complex. Bitcoin can be simple. No one has to change Bitcoin at all. And I think this is basically the same thesis that I've had. So I've basically taken the opposite side of the bet from Vitalik. And I do think that doing what they did was easier in the short term, longer and harder in the long term. The design choices that we have made are harder in the short term, but they're more fundamental and better in the long term. And I think at some point we're gonna actually see that play out.
I have a question about Taproot, Bitcoin's recent upgrade. Now, in the past, you've had soft forks that take a long time for developers to actually integrate and build on top of that. And so, you think about SegWit, and it took years to even get 50% penetration. And so, with respect to Taproot, I mean, does this change anything in the near future with respect to Bitcoin and DeFi?
Yeah, so I think Taproot rollout was, I love Taproot. I think it's great. It's the first major upgrade that has happened since the ugly wars of 2017. So which means that Bitcoin community can come together in a sensible way, can make small upgrades. But these upgrades are always going to be like incremental, right? Nothing drastic is going to happen at the Bitcoin layer. So the Taproot thing is amazing because it points back to the question you were asking earlier, that Taproot was celebrated in the Bitcoin circles as this amazing thing that is bringing smart contracts to Bitcoin. It's not. Taproot does not. I'll explain that a little bit. But the reaction was that people were celebrating Bitcoin smart contracts when Taproot was coming out. And Stacks literally actually enables Bitcoin smart contracts, and there's like this sort of a resistance to what Stacks is doing. So interestingly, what Taproot is it's very simple. All it does is it reduces the size of certain complex Bitcoin transactions. And because of that reduction in size, you also get some privacy benefits. 0 smart contracts get enabled because of Taproot. Like nothing, absolutely nothing changes, right? It was purely a marketing campaign to portray Taproot as smart contracts. All it does is stuff that was already possible with Bitcoin, you can do it with slightly smaller transactions and with somewhat better privacy. That's it. Right, but the thing to celebrate is that people and a decentralized ecosystem came together to peacefully upgrade, and I think that was something that truly deserves to be celebrated.
Are we able to take any audience questions? Yeah. Okay. Does anybody have anything they want to throw in? We have 2 minutes left. Okay. I guess one thing I'm interested in is
we're really scary, Muneeb. Do you have a question?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you're getting a microphone.
Okay. Well, I'm just wondering because this is very interesting, and congratulations for this thing that's been built. That's awesome. So it seems to me the biggest issue right now is governments shutting private citizens out of the kind of economic system. That you have this digital economic system, and now you have this new way to just flip a switch, no trial, nothing. Somebody's just shut out of the economic system. And I'm wondering what sort of precautions or what activities should be happening now to try to preserve people's right to participate economically. I think a lot of innocent people getting rolled up in things that aren't their fault. And You know, it just seems like that's a big problem. So, what are your thoughts?
Go ahead.
Do you want to take it? I think let me first make sure that I understood your question properly.
Yeah, there was even a coffee shop that I think served coffee to people that were part of the protests, and they had their bank accounts frozen. It's fucked.
Yeah, I think this is one of those things that comes back to what I was talking about earlier, that this generation has never experienced stuff like that before, right? Like, people got so used to trusting their banks that they don't view their bank account as something that, hey, it could be you could be locked out of it. This money can be taken away from you. And I personally, like, years ago, was doing things like, I would have multiple bank accounts and put like a little bit of money in one account, or try to actually have geographic decentralization, like both in terms of your personal security of like your private keys, or even your money. And people would, like, my wife would look at me and be like, "You're crazy," right? Like, the amount of time that you waste in trying to, let me just say it this way, that my Bitcoin is not even dependent on the US. I can access my Bitcoin even if I cannot physically access the United States. And I was doing that like 3 years ago, right? And people would be like, "You're crazy, like, why are you wasting so much of your time like doing these weird things?" And then later on you realize that the existing financial system is not going to go away peacefully, right? Like, right now, people think Bitcoin is a joke, or it's turning. Like, in the last couple of years, they're like, maybe it's not a joke, right? But once they start viewing that as a real threat, like, things are going to get ugly, right? Like, this is, we have a precedence to that in the early 90s, when there were the first kind of like crypto wars, and they were mostly about encryption. This is much bigger than that. This is not just about encryption and your right to basically talk to people without anyone monitoring. This is about you owning your own wealth and being able to transact with people without anyone interrupting that, right? So I feel like the best we can do is, again, like, educate everyone during the peaceful times so that people can be much, much better prepared when these bad things happen.
But the important thing I want to add is, like, again, Bitcoin itself is not a panacea. So one thing that started happening, the OSC first started shutting down bank accounts. Then the OSC sent open letters to Kraken, Coinbase, and other exchanges that operate in Canada, threatening them and asking them to start shutting down accounts. I think the important thing to remember is owning Bitcoin on a centralized exchange is not the same as owning your own Bitcoin and holding your own keys. Not your keys, not your coins, very much the case. And I fully appreciate that fully custodial exchanges are an easy on-ramp to get people into Bitcoin. But if you don't have your own keys, you don't have shit. And that's the same for Bitcoin that you put in DeFi, or Bitcoin that you wrap and use in DeFi protocols. Like, if you don't control your keys, you don't have Bitcoin. What you have is an IOU, which is the same thing that you have when you deposit your money at a commercial banking institution. And what's really scary to me is, like, the crypto wars, which started in the early 90s, they're back. It's called the Earn It Bill and Section 230. Like, they're back. Nobody's talking about the fact that this bill just passed the first round of voting in the Senate, and it's going to go to the Senate floor, and unless we get really active, it will pass. And it is a bill that seeks to limit our ability as consumers to use end-to-end encryption in communication. And money, right, as code is a type of communication. Bitcoin at its core is just a communication protocol. What we communicate is information about money, around value, right? So I don't think what people realize is, like, yes, all of the stuff we've built is great, but all of the value is being captured by centralized institutions that are just replicating traditional financial intermediaries. So what we're doing right now is a good starting point, but it's not good enough. And we're all gonna have to work together to make it easier for people to manage their own keys, for people to hold their own Bitcoin, and to really ensure that when people start getting into this ecosystem, that they understand there's a fundamental difference between owning Bitcoin on a centralized exchange or via an intermediary and owning Bitcoin that you hold the keys to. And again, not easy, will take time, but at this point we're 13 years into the Bitcoin experiment, and it's no longer acceptable for us to continue doing the same thing. So I'm hardcore on that train. I know Muneeb is as well.
Yeah.
And hopefully there are some entrepreneurs here who are working on multi-sig wallets and other technologies to make that easier. If you're looking for a good tool, full shill, I'm an investor in this, but Casa is a great one for Bitcoin, but there will be others, I'm sure.
So to end things on a slightly more positive note,
Yeah.
I think both Bitcoin and encryption, at the end of the day, it's mathematics, it's code, and I think once people know that 2 + 2 = 4, no one can make you unlearn that.
You can't ban math, unfortunately.
You cannot ban
They're gonna
math,
try.
no matter what you do. These things are fundamental. As long as people can write code and math works, Bitcoin will work, encryption will work, and I think let's just pause there before we get into an anti-government rant.
Wait, I am told that we have time for one more question. Okay, yeah, you can go ahead. This way.
I'll try to make it quick. First off, thank you, Muneeb, for how you act on Twitter. I know there's been a lot of vitriol thrown your way, and I think you rose above that. So I appreciate how you conduct yourself on Twitter. It brings a lot more eyes to that, and I think you rise above and look great on that. So thank you. Second of all, Matt Odell, Marty Bent, they're all on Twitter bashing about the pre-mine. And I don't have access to the BMN, Liquid, all that stuff is just a pleb. So I appreciate that Stacks does that. So I would like to know what you could give people like us to counteract that pre-mine, even though it was done legitimately, it was all out in the open, but that seems to be their point. They come back at you. And if you could give us some direction on that, that would be much appreciative. Leadership on that. And are you going to do push-ups, Meltem?
Absolutely. So I think the way to think about that is any project at the end of the day requires some sort of funding. If you look at Stacks, like there has been I would say tens of millions of dollars in engineering salaries over the years that has gone out to develop open source code. Like the code is absolutely open source. Anyone can fork it. Anyone can do whatever they want with it. So that money had to come from somewhere, right? So the reason these token offerings exist is to basically try to kickstart an effort that can be good for society and do it that way. But when we looked at it, and we looked at all the options available, what we did was we tried to make the initial offering as transparent and as open as possible. And we actually went through so much trouble with the regulators. This was the first ever SEC qualified offering, which meant that anybody could participate. People had full disclosures on the type of risks that are there, on every information. I think it's probably the most comprehensive report on a project you could actually read, because there are no skeletons left once you do an SEC offering, right? Because everything is public, everything is transparent, and then most importantly, it's actually, again, it's one of those things that we tend to do a lot in Stacks, that we tend to do the hard things up front. Like, it could have been way easier to just block out the normal people, especially in the US, and just go and raise money from large funds. But we didn't do that because we thought that this project is really for the people, and you can't just block out the community and the developers, especially the people who live in the US, because most of the early team members came from there. So that's how we organized it. I think it was transparent. I think it was fair. It was open to the public, and that's how the project started.
And I'll add to that. So I've been actively raising money for the MIT DCI, which funds Bitcoin core development. They have 6 Bitcoin core developers on staff who get paid anywhere between $100,000 and $175,000 a year as Bitcoin core devs. The Bitcoin protocol has created over $1 trillion of value. There are individuals and firms who have realized billions of dollars of economic value from Bitcoin who have contributed $0 to Bitcoin's open source development. Zero. Nothing. So last year we set out to raise $8 million committed over 4 years for the DCI. Do you know how long it took to do that? It took almost a full year. I had to personally go and talk to people who I know have made a lot of money from Bitcoin, firms who are very involved in Bitcoin. They don't have a single Bitcoin dev on staff. Blockstream is one of the few organizations that employs a Bitcoin dev who works on the core protocol. Coinbase doesn't employ a Bitcoin dev. Kraken doesn't employ one. NYDIG doesn't employ one. They give to the DCI. We give to the DCI, we have a Lightning developer on staff, but like, where are these firms that are creating billions of dollars of value for their founders and their investors? Where are they in contributing to Bitcoin's open source development? They're not there. Now that's slowly starting to change, but I think people don't understand it's very difficult to compel a very talented Bitcoin developer to work for very little money when everyone else is making tremendous amounts of money off their work. Like, most Bitcoin developers don't even own 10 Bitcoin. So I think that's hugely problematic, and this is another debate that's been going on, like, what is reasonable compensation for a protocol developer? It's really hard to incentivize someone to stay when they could go and build their own project, raise tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars of venture capital and make themselves like wealthy in the process, versus working at a nonprofit, developing code and keeping Bitcoin as a code base secure when it's not economically viable. So I think, again, it's really important, like my firm, we give to the DCI, I personally give to the DCI, because we care about Bitcoin. We need Bitcoin to remain secure. Like, we derive value from the Bitcoin protocol. So I think, how are you gonna bootstrap a huge effort like building a new protocol, building a new code base? How are you gonna employ people? How are you gonna incentivize people with $0? I think there's this unrealistic expectation that every protocol will be able to do what Bitcoin did, and you can't, because Bitcoin was the first. Right? But all of the rest of us, like, there's so many different models, and there's certainly protocols that have been far more egregious in terms of how value is distributed amongst early founders. So I think you've done a really good job threading the needle, but it isn't as easy as people think. Having tried to raise money for open source core protocol development is really hard, and people don't want to open their wallets because it's a tragedy of the commons issue. So it sucks. It's shitty.
I think to take a snapshot of today, like, I'm really excited that just in the last 6 months or so, there's been close to maybe $350 million of capital injection into the Stacks ecosystem. And if you compare that to other Bitcoin projects, I'm sorry to say this, it's a sad state of affairs, but a lot of the things that are being built on Bitcoin outside of Stacks would be 1 or 2 open source developers with barely any funding, and those projects don't go anywhere. Also because of the fact that they don't have any capital. So I think having capital, like, obviously we want to build a community where people are driven by the mission and they are doing it for the mission. But at some point you need to have enough capital base to be able to take care of your living expenses, and so that developers don't have to worry about such things.
Muneeb, Meltem, thank you both so much. Thank you to the Stacks Foundation, and thank you for letting us run over.